Millions of people mourn the loss of Iran's former president. Does the passing of Rafsanjani also mean the death of moderate leadership in Iran? Also on today's program, Venezuela's cash crisis. President Maduro raises the minimum wage for the 5th time in a year as inflation soars. And Barack Obama bids farewell. In his final speech as US president, he pleads with Americans to defend their democracy. I'm Imran Garda, and this is the Newsmakers. In death, as in life, Iran's former president Rafsanjani brought together hardliners and reformers. More than 2 million people from across the political spectrum filled the streets of Tehran for his funeral, in scenes that Iran hadn't seen in almost 30 years. He was one of the country's most influential figures since the revolution in 1979. Praised in the West for his pragmatic leadership, he pushed to normalize ties with the US. He was also a surprise supporter of the anti-Ahmadinejad demonstrations in 2009, with many of those protesters claiming him as one of their own. But he was once a staunch conservative and is criticized for a crackdown on dissidents during his rule, as well as his handling of Iran's war with Iraq. Loudspeakers at his funeral sometimes struggled to drown out protesters chanting opposition slogans. Yet he was seen as a counterbalance to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and the country's hardline factions. And with him gone, many people wonder what will come next. Today's newsmaker is the former Iranian president, Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, as we ask what his death means for the future of Iran.
Iran is a nation in mourning, bidding a long goodbye to the former president, Ayatollah Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, whose influence spanned and shaped 4 decades of Iranian politics, looming large in death as he did in life.
از پایه‌های اساسی کشور تو تصمیم‌های سیاسی آقای هاشمی بوده.
تدبیر و درایت و فکر حضرت آیت الله هاشمی همیشه پشتوانه انقلاب و مردم بوده است.
فقدان ایشون برای مردم کشورمون خیلی سخت هستش و فکرم نمی‌کنم جایگزینی برای ایشون پیدا بشه.
And in the anguish, there is also anxiety. His passing has opened up questions about the political divisions which mark Iranian society. Rafsanjani was viewed as a crucial public supporter of the moderate voice. And his death now leaves that role open. Just months before his protege, President Hassan Rouhani, seeks re-election. Rafsanjani is considered one of the founding fathers of the Islamic Republic of Iran. He was a confidant of the first supreme leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and was believed to have played an influential role in installing the second supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Rafsanjani was also regarded by some to be a pragmatic politician, carving his own role into modern Iranian history. He became the nation's first president after the Iran-Iraq War. And in recent years, he headed up the Expediency Council, the political body which settles disputes between Parliament and the Guardian Council, walking the path between moderate and hardline factions. He advocated for rapprochement with the West and developing Iran's economic relationship with the outside world, and was also a vocal supporter of the 2015 Iran deal signed by Rouhani's government. Even though the majority of Iranians were born after the revolution, Rafsanjani held a political capital which was able to bridge the generation gap. So who can fill that void now that one of the Republic's pillars has passed on? Natalie Perhanan, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Tehran is Ghanbar Naderi. He's a political analyst and journalist with the Kayhan International newspaper. And here in studio with me is Borzo Daragahi, Middle East correspondent for BuzzFeed News. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Borzo, when you read about Iran from the outside, You read about someone like Rafsanjani, you hear moderate, reformist. But in many ways, those sorts of words are used so often that they seem meaningless sometimes. Was he truly a reformist? Was he truly a moderate? And if so, why?
Well, he was a politician, first and foremost. And I would say that, he was a pragmatist in that he, like most politicians, was sort of an opportunist. Throughout the world, politicians are opportunists. And he evolved with the times. He was a staunch conservative in the sort of traditional conservative faction in Iran when it suited his political interests. And then when that didn't suit his political interests, he sort of evolved. He rebranded himself to a certain extent as a champion of the moderates, even to some extent, a champion of the reformists. And that's how he went out at the end of his life, even if he was not necessarily himself ideologically committed to any of the positions. And we don't know what his real feelings were, what his real ideology was. He found a way for himself to have a political life and to pursue his own interests and pursue his political interests in a way that he thought best suited the survival of the Islamic Republic.
Khanbar Naderi, is that accurate? Is that fair that we don't know for sure what his true positions were?
Well, until 10 years ago, you might say we had some ideas about his, political affiliations, where he wanted to go, where he wanted to be heading to, especially with regards to his followers. But the biggest problem with Mr. Rafsanjani, indeed with other political figures, even our artists, our anti-Iran establishment, anti-establishment, anti-Iran currents outside the country, is that the biggest challenge for all of them is that they have failed to contemporize. If they cannot contemporize, if they cannot modernize their views, their aspirations, they have no place within the Iranian society. Just as we can say it with 100% confidence that the current government doesn't have any place among the younger generation of this country, because we have a cabinet of grannies that belongs to the 20th century, and they have no idea what does it mean to live in the 21st century. So my own argument is that Mr. Rafsanjani, just like many other politicians in Iran, failed to connect with the modern world, with the modern generation of Iranians.
But you say he failed to connect, but then there were those, particularly in 2009, who saw him as one of them. He didn't wholeheartedly support, say, the Green Revolution and those protesters, but he gave a little nod of encouragement to them, right? And isn't there a bit of a clue? Isn't it quite revealing that at the funeral you had groups of mourners chanting opposition slogans, or Hussein, Mir Hussein, referring to Mousavi? It seemed as if they still rallied around him being some sort of symbol of change, right?
Well, that gathering had nothing to do with Mr. Rafsanjani or his funeral, and everything to do with some kind of, showing solidarity, showing some kind of unity among different factions of this country to the outside world, and they have somehow succeeded. But if you ask me, I have talked to many conservatives, many reformists. They just don't want to see each other. They don't want to see each other face to face, let alone give some kind of compliments to each other. So if they gathered there, the conservatives were there, if our leader was there, he even failed, he even refused to give his final blessing and his final forgiveness to Mr. Rafsanjani. What does it mean? It means that he has not forgiven Mr. Rafsanjani for playing a role in the 1998-1999 post-election unrest in the Iranian capital. So if you want to ask me, my argument is that it was only for sure. It was a facade to show to the rest of the international community that this country is still, standing together. But at the end of the day, everybody went their own separate ways.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, Burzu, from here, I'm consuming the media. I'm seeing 2.5 million people at the funeral. I'm seeing Ayatollah Ali Khamenei leading the funeral. You'd think that he had the wholehearted support of the establishment and the leadership. What Ghanbar is saying is not so fast. Do you agree with that?
I mean, Rafsanjani himself, he did not have the wholehearted support of the establishment. Many people inside the establishment, many conservatives, really, they really hate him. They really despised him. For example, the former president, Ahmadinejad, considered him and publicly called him a crook and a criminal. For example, the supreme leader himself, in his final condolences, demoted Rafsanjani from an Ayatollah to a Hujjatullah Islam, which is a much lower ranking clerical level. And so, yes, people came out, but even in some of the video clips you saw like extreme rifts between people in the factions in the society. For example, you saw a video clip of Rafsanjani's son holding back the head of the state television, who wanted to be one of the pallbearers to carry Rafsanjani's coffin, and Rafsanjani's son was literally physically holding him back, preventing him from getting near him because of the animosity between the two factions, between because of the fight between the two different groups in the society, the moderate reformists on the one hand and the conservative hardliners on the other.
So, Ghanbar, with the death of this man who was in many ways sort of in between the two polarities here, has this tilted the momentum in favor of the hardliners, in favor of the conservative hardliners who really loathed him?
Absolutely, you are spot on. The biggest loser of the death of Mr. Rafsanjani has to be President Rouhani. As you just mentioned earlier in your program, Mr. Rafsanjani had been a kingmaker of this country. He endorsed and he helped Imam Khomeini to become the first supreme leader of this country. Then he endorsed the leadership of our current leader, who is Ayatollah Khamenei, and Mr. Rouhani, for the past 3.5 years, has refused to act and behave like a president. He is representing himself as the next supreme leader of this country, and he needed all the support and endorsement of Mr. Rafsanjani to make his dreams come true. The problem now is that Mr. Rafsanjani is no longer among us, and it means that President Rouhani has lost one of his biggest supporters to become the next leader of this country. So make no mistakes, the biggest winners of this, this sad occasion of the passing of Mr. Rafsanjani has to be the hardliners, and they have already begun full force going for the next presidential race, and they want to make sure that Mr. Rouhani has no chance whatsoever to win the presidential election for the next round.
Rouhani weakened? Is that the way you see it, Borzou?
Well, it's hard to say. And, I've gotten very, very careful about trying to predict things in Iran. No one predicted Khatami's rise, his meteoric rise. That was the reformist president of Iran who came to power in 1997. No one predicted the election of Ahmadinejad at all. No one expected him to defeat to defeat Hashemi Rafsanjani in 2005. No one expected millions of people, young people, old people from different classes, to pour into the streets of Tehran and other cities in 2009 and protest against the allegedly fraudulent elections of that year. And no one expected Rouhani to beat out a sea of conservative candidates to win in the first round of 2013. So I think it's a fool's game predicting stuff about Iran, predicting politics in Iran. I'll refrain from doing that, but I would say it could go either way, because in many ways, Rafsanjani, because of the reputation he had as corrupt, as sort of this wily, opportunistic politician, he may have in some ways hurt and constrained Rouhani, and now Rouhani can himself take on the mantle of being the leader of the moderates and the reformists, if he's wily enough to do that, and he seems like enough of a tough insider to be able to do that, and launch a whole new generation of moderate reform in Iran.
Ghanbar, to pick up on something Borzou said, he mentioned the corrupt reputation. Rafsanjani was a very wealthy man from pistachio farming and exports. Was he a corrupt man?
Well, let's not talk about Mr. Rafsanjani. He's a gone man. He's a goner.
No, but I mean, just very simply, is that justified when people call him corrupt?
One point.
Sure.
Yes,
So if you could answer that.
He was a corrupt politician.
Yeah.
Yes, he was a corrupt politician, and he took advantage of his position on several occasions to make himself and his families and those around him as rich as possible. And there is no doubt about it. There is no argument about it. Your distinguished guest is right, absolutely right. But there is one problem here. I think he was right to some extent to say that it is difficult to predict the politics in this country, but that belongs to the past. When Iran was selling oil at $140 a barrel, with oil prices down the drain now, nobody wants to take any unnecessary chances. There is no more any room for error in this country. That's why it's easier than ever to predict what will happen next time when we have the next presidential race, and of course, when we have to choose our next leader. So I can tell you with 100% confidence that the moderates, the so-called moderates and the reformists are not going to have any say in these two important, occasions in our history.
Okay, you're much more confident about the future. Burcu is not. Burcu, one final question for you. You cover the region a lot, particularly in terms of how Iran projects itself in foreign policy in the region. Its staunch ally is Russia. At the funeral, you had protesters saying death to Russia. Tell me what's behind that.
Well, I think there's a couple things going on. I think that they're to some extent mocking those hardliners who say death to America at every occasion, sort of noting the utter dependence, security-wise, of the Iranian establishment, the Iranian regime, on this sort of Russia overall security blanket. And that really hurts the pride of Iranians who pride themselves on their independence. But I also think that there might be some just concern about there is some latent concern, and you see reports of it, about the Iranian role in Syria and the sort of collaboration with Russia in taking part in that civil war and the cost of that.
Okay, that's fascinating. Gentlemen, we could go on forever. This is fantastic. Really enjoyed it, Khanbar Naderi and Burcu Daragahi. Unfortunately, I've got to wrap. Thanks so much for joining us. Venezuela's economy seems to be in a tailspin. You need an increasingly large stack of cash to buy the most basic necessities, and that's if you can find them. There are widespread shortages of food and medicine, and inflation is in the triple digits. Now, President Nicolás Maduro has introduced new measures in an attempt to stop the financial bleeding. But critics say it won't work, and opposition lawmakers say the president has effectively abandoned his post and needs to be replaced. Yvette McCullough explains.
President Nicolás Maduro's latest attempt to fix Venezuela's crippling inflation crisis, increasing the minimum wage by 50%. The wage is going up to 40,000 bolivars a month. That amounts to around $60 at the official exchange rate, but just $12 on the black market. It's the fifth increase, which has now seen the wage rise a cumulative 322% since last February. Maduro says this will protect jobs and income.
As long as there is this war, we will continue with a bold, just and necessary policy to seek harmony and balance of employment and income.
But opponents say even this dramatic increase won't give people enough to live on and will lead to further inflation and job losses. Venezuela's economy has been spiralling since a drop in global oil prices in 2014. And the situation is desperate. Inflation is in triple figures. Huge price increases and shortages of basic food and medicines have people at the mercy of the black market. And looting has become common. Plans to pull the 100 bolivar note and issue new 500 to 20,000 denominations have faced delays, adding to the chaos.
Last night I had to pay 5,000 bolivars in bills of 100 to be able to buy some flour to be able to eat. They didn't accept the 100 bills. These don't function. You can't eat with that.
Venezuela's opposition is desperate to remove Maduro from power. It has now passed a resolution saying that Maduro has abandoned his post, failing to perform his basic duties of governing the country.
The resolution shows that the only way to solve the serious problems afflicting the country is to return power to the people of Venezuela.
The opposition has been pushing for a recall referendum to force new presidential elections, but its attempts have been repeatedly blocked by the Supreme Court. Maduro says enemies abroad are to blame for Venezuela's problems.
The irritating and null manifesto, which lacks any form of effectiveness and which was approved by the gang in the National Assembly yesterday, is a manifesto representing a coup.
With Venezuela's crisis deepening, will Maduro's new measures be enough to fight off his political foes and bring the country's economy back from the brink of collapse? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Michael Bayne. He's a senior political risk analyst at the consulting firm Allen & Associates. He specializes in Latin America. Thanks so much for joining us, Michael. So raising the minimum wage by 50% to combat inflation, is that a bad idea?
Yeah, it's almost a meaningless gesture, to be honest with you. They've now raised the minimum wage 5 different times in the past year. But inflation is so high, it's in fact the highest in the world, that it's almost certain that within a couple months they'll have to raise it once again, because as soon as they raise it, it becomes almost worthless. So what it's at right now is on the black market only about $11 a month anyway. So
yeah,
it's really just a meaningless gesture.
Yeah, and I'm looking at some horrendous stories coming out of here. Been following AP correspondent Hannah Dreyer. She's got stories of people giving up their children because they can't afford them. Food shortages, widespread looting, gangs roaming the streets. The IMF says inflation is going to reach 1,600% this year. How else can this government stop the country from this economic free fall?
It's actually pretty hard to see exactly how they can move forward. Right now, what their problem is that they have price controls that make it almost impossible to make a profit in the country, currency and capital controls that make it almost impossible to repatriate that profit, even if you do happen to make one. And so it's almost impossible to do business in Venezuela. They could get rid of these systems, of course, but the government has become so wed to them in its rhetoric, in the actions of it, in its actions for the past decade, that it's very hard to see them completely changing course, although they obviously have to.
Yeah, you mentioned the government being wedded to it in its rhetoric. Maduro blames economic war and mafia attacks, as he calls it. What does he mean exactly, right. And might there be even a kernel of truth in it?
Look, Venezuela's problems are caused by Venezuelan policies. It's certainly true that the United States has poor relations with Venezuela, but the idea that that's the genesis of its economic problems is false. He claims that there's all sorts of speculative attacks against the currency that's being carried out by mafias in Colombia and the United States. But the fact of the matter is, the reason the currency is worthless is because they're printing up tons of it, and there's almost nothing being produced in Venezuela right now, apart from oil, the price of which is way down. So, the problems really lie with the Venezuelan state.
Right, and based on all the available evidence, in your opinion, is Chavismo and the Bolivarian socialist revolution in Venezuela, is it dead?
I don't think it's entirely dead, to be honest with you. In addition to the economic crisis, there's also a political crisis. And as we heard, the National Assembly just recently voted to declare that Maduro has abandoned the presidency. But Maduro holds a lot of cards in his hands. He certainly hasn't respected that, and the Supreme Court has already struck it down. So he could hang on, and he could hang on until the end of his term. I think that's possible. But for the revolution being a model that anyone in Latin America would want to copy, I think that is dead. That was once the dream that we could almost unite Latin America under this banner of Chavismo, but that dream is dead.
Troubling times for the people of Venezuela, no matter where they stand on the political spectrum. Michael Bayne, thanks so much for joining us. Donald Trump is once again dominating the headlines, this time denying allegations that Russia has compromising information about him. But Tuesday night was President Barack Obama's moment in the spotlight as he addressed the nation for a final time. Take a listen.
I do have one final ask of you as your president. The same thing I asked when you took a chance on me 8 years ago. I'm asking you to believe, not in my ability to bring about change, but in yours. I'm asking you to hold fast to that faith written into our founding documents, that idea whispered by slaves and abolitionists, that spirit sung by immigrants and homesteaders and those who marched for justice, that creed reaffirmed by those who planted flags from foreign battlefields to the surface of the moon, a creed at the core of every American whose story is not yet written. Yes, we can. Yes, we did. Yes, we can. Thank you. God bless you. May God continue to bless the United States of America. Thank you.
You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.